Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is DISCREET, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would like to begin a discussion of the releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2021. And the first film that I would like to focus upon, if you don't mind, is a film that was from 1972, and in fact it is a film that was in the Criterion Collection before at spine number 102, but now we have it in a brand new Blu-ray release, and this is from the filmmaker Luis Buñuel. The name of the film is, and please pardon me for my poor pronunciation, Le Charme Discret de la Bourgeoisie, or in English, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. So this is the release made by the Criterion Collection of the film from 1972, Luis Buñuel's masterpiece, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. Let me say, before we move on with any specific details, let me say that this release, this film, forms part of a larger release that was again made earlier this year, which is called Three Films by Luis Buñuel, and it comes in this box set. One of the films being, of course, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. My plan is to focus a discussion on each of the films in separate videos, and then concluding with a discussion of the box and the overall release itself. So I will reserve my comments about the overall release for a separate video. So if you're interested, please stay tuned for updates on that. In the meantime, however, let us focus our attention specifically on this film and this particular part of that release and what this particular disc has to offer in terms of its presentation and supplements, as I say, with regard to this marvelous, miraculous work and quite complex work called The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. This is, of course, a film that comes in the later period, or one of the final phases of the great and extraordinary career of Luis Buñuel that spans decades. And here we have what could be said, on the one hand, to be a sort of triumphant establishment or reestablishment of the cinematic greatness of Luis Buñuel in the form of this and other films of the era. But what we also have here is Luis Buñuel, the artist and observer of human behavior and societies, giving us another biting, satirical-edged comic masterpiece that also creates this sense of unease and also a sense of social critique, and also a sense of drawing attention to what is absurd. And perhaps what he is saying in the long run is that that which is absurd in the world of The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie might be closer to home than we might initially think upon initial watch of this film. And so that, I think, lays the groundwork for a work that is wholly enriching and very timely. And it has not, I would suggest, lost any of its edge as years pass. I would say, on the contrary, it still maintains a fresh and strong sense of currency and relevance, even as the years progress beyond the initial one of 1972. Which is all to say, therefore, that this is a universal film that also is tied to its era, but it is, in that and many other ways, a nuanced and complex work. And that is, of course, the way things are in the great world and highly genius-level art that is the works of Luis Buñuel, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. If we were to try, of course, to distill the film to its essence, we can talk about how it is based on a conceit of a group of characters that are essentially trying to assemble and have a meal. And through various scenarios and skits, essentially, they are either thwarted, or they are their plans are upended, or they are distracted, or certain avenues of tangential relationship occur, thus creating diversions into other territories, and so on and so forth. Along the way, we get the various situations, both character and plot-driven situations, that involve the various core group of characters that I say are in essence trying to assemble. We also get along the way other personages and other characters and other situations that that envelop or occupy or intrude or otherwise upend the balance of the proceedings. And this comes in the form of various asides involving primary or secondary characters, and these asides lead to even further asides, and so this is the development upon development upon development of what might be termed to be a side story. But in fact, the side stories tend to become more parallel to the main course of action, and that becomes, I think, clear as the film progresses. So what seems to be tangential, in fact, becomes something that is very primary to the overall hypothesis, if you will, of the film that is driving Luis Buñuel and Jean-Claude Carrier and company when we're talking about the discrete charm of the bourgeoisie. So we have asides, but that are ultimately very much part of the entire package of the film. We also have the interruption or intrusion or inclusion of the dream landscape. And so this is something that's commented upon a lot, I think, in terms of Buñuel's filmography writ large, the idea of his reliance and use of the power of dreams and the power of the ability of the dreamscape to not only attach towards something that is deep-rooted in the subconscious of an individual human being, but also direct one's attention to the potential absurdity of a particular situation that the dreamscape and the logic or illogic of the dream environment can lead to. And that, of course, creates a bundle of possibilities, both artistic and also thematic. On the artistic level, of course, this creates the ability to give us an absurd take on this particular situation that I say is playing itself out through various applied skits and scenarios. The attempt of these characters to assemble and essentially to have a situation that culminates in a feast or a banquet or some kind of gathering of that sort. And so the absurdist nature of what might be called the dream logic that is applied both directly and indirectly can lead to absurdist, comic, and quite satirical situations. And the more one inspects and views and pays attention to the particular details that emerge, the more one realizes that what we are dealing with is something that might seem on the surface in some components to be, quote-unquote, a depiction of the real versus a depiction of the dream. But in fact, the more we listen to, for example, bits of dialogue or little details of the frame or the mise en scène, the more we realize that in fact what seems to be real could be just as absurd as the dreamscape that is directly involved in the plot proceedings. So that gives way to a sort of license, if you will, or for lack of a better phrase, an artistic freedom, the ability to apply the absurd in these concrete cinematic expressions that lead to building blocks, if you will, of realization. And that realization, as I say, comes in the form of comedy or humor or satire or absurdity. And it becomes very fresh and inventive and very exciting. And this is, of course, very much part of the Luis Buñuel cinema experience from the very beginning of his career all the way up to, as I say, the later stages in which we find ourselves when we're dealing with The Discrete Charm of the Bourgeoisie, the film The Discrete Charm of the Bourgeoisie, excuse me. However, I also mentioned that this application can also lead to a thematic distillation or thematic concern played out in Luis Buñuel's cinema. And this is, of course, the idea of the application of of satire and comedy with its roots in the absurd that is tied into this seemingly direct cinematic grammar of dream logic that seems to be on display, at least directly speaking, in this film. So the application of that construct applied to thematic concerns of this film lead to, I think, very profound places. And they are profound in a way that my comments will, of course, not do any justice to the particular concerns, and because I'm not a social scientist and I'm not an expert, and so my comments are going to be very shallow. But in an attempt to try to identify at least some areas where I think this film is dealing very vibrantly and very directly with and very pointedly in terms of groupings of thematic concerns based on this construct of absurdity, cinematic absurdity, it would be, for example, we have undoubtedly the treatment of these core group of characters. And these characters are, I think, very clearly from certain social strata, certain classes, certain representations of a social class, and also power structures. Diplomats or areas of government are also being represented here. There are also some side stories about power structures and social strata as represented through figures of religious institution, as well as figures of authority, police and the like, and the military. But what we are dealing with here are social strata and class structures of a particular area or areas of class and stratification of societies that can be said to be maybe the higher classes, the upper classes, if you will. The linkages, therefore, to the application of the title bourgeoisie come into play, I think, in those broad terms. That is an examination of these particular characters that are found, as I say, within these varying, related, similarly leveled social strata. And this is very important because if we think about that examination as applied via the lens of absurdity and comedy, we can see that Buñuel is perhaps, and company, are making fun of these characters' seemingly irrational attachments to various forms and rituals that are otherwise on display in what might be termed to be generally accepted society. So, for example, we have various episodes where we see these characters seemingly attached to some kind of ritualistic set of societal mores or mores that are then stripped away clean or perhaps sliced through, much like Buñuel slicing through things like a razor blade that he's carrying in his hand. He is slicing through the illusion of the importance of these rituals or forms or social constructs or dynamics. And he's making a case, perhaps, that perhaps this setting of social stratification is much more illusory than one might think. So that's one broad thematic concern. That is also related to the notion of the sources of power. And if we think about the sources of power rooted in society, we can see that sources of power are, of course, based on the physical means, but they are also based on perceptions that are rooted in societally based perceptions. In other words, how society perceives one group of society that maybe has, say, more sources of wealth directly accessible than, say, other groups of societies. And that might lead to the establishment of the perception of one social group having more power or authority than, say, other social groups. And I think this is very important too, because we have a group of characters that not just belong to a similar level of social class or wealth and influence, but they are also interacting along the way with other, say, characters that are arguably on the periphery, but are also belonging to other social groups, so the people who are in the servant class, other characters that that are interacted with that might be said to be of the agrarian class or a peasant class situation. And so these are other characters that, as I say, are on the periphery, or the working class. They are on the periphery, but they are always being encountered with by this core set of characters. And so we see through these encounters a type of belittlement, or a type of mocking, or a type of seemingly innocent joking aside between and among the core group of characters. But through that examination, we also see, or we are able to identify, the sense of the source of the almost imbecilic nature of the way that one group views the other. To the point where it becomes, as I say, silly or imbecilic or absurd or stupid, thus creating the source of the means by which Buñuel uses his cinema to slice through this illusion of a power or authority of one group over the other. And I think it's through that juxtaposition that this slicing through becomes even clearer because of the deep-rooted idiotic nature, if you will, of what's being focused on. I mean, it's being laughed at, or it becomes the source of the comedy. And this is very clear and apparent. And if it's becoming the source of the comedy, then that by its very nature is a means by which Buñuel and company are, in essence, sapping that subject, sapping the power from that subject matter. So in other words, it's using the power of the cinema of comedy and satire to, like a razor blade through the illusion, sapping the power from this particular source. And I find that to be a very powerful and subtle way to apply the mode of satire in cinema. And that's one of the reasons why Buñuel's cinema is as powerful as it is, even now to the present day. So that's another way that I think the thematic concerns are playing themselves out. And I think also we have to keep in mind that these are all, of course, discussions that could be said to be on a broad scale, on a broad level, discussions rooted in society and class and wealth. And if we go specifically, we can go also to more detailed and more intricate discussions of particular modes and movements of political theory and society. The word bourgeoisie itself is very much the implication of that usage, of course, goes to the roots of things like, say, discussions of Marxist theory. And if we think about those potential intricate discussions, of course they are related in a broad level or they're related to the broad level discussion, as I was trying to allude to a few moments ago. But we also have to keep in mind that this film is also very inherently dealing with not just the examination and satirical look at these social structures, but it's also looking at and examining, perhaps arguably through a same or similar satirical lens. You be the judge of that as viewers of the film. But it's also examining the nature of revolution and the nature of upheaval, and also the nature of change and the deep-rooted nature of change that also is potentially very violent, and also is involving the idea of threats to the system, threats to the ways of life that these core characters are indeed experiencing on a very day-to-day mundane level, so mundane as to be focusing in on characters trying to have a meal, right? But the idea of revolution and violence also intrudes upon those proceedings in a way that I think is inescapable and undeniably an examination of the idea or threat of the usurpation of power and the upending or the upheaval of one power structure over the other. Revolution, we call that revolution, or we call that the overthrow of power, and in the place of that, what happens. And so this conversation is also quite there. And the key to that conversation is not just the focusing in on what are considered to be, or what are described to be, the revolutionary characters or the terrorist characters that are a part of some of the plot proceedings of this film. That's there as well. But the other side of that coin, of course, is the establishment or the discussion of the already established power structures And so we have the power structures, plus we have the revolutionary spirit that is, in essence, in collusion, or not include. It's clashing with those power structures. So we have two sides of the same essential class conflict, right? And so if we think about the class conflict, we also therefore see in this film the establishment of the power structures, and that comes in the form of the military, the police, the clergy, so the religious institutions, and also certain facets or avenues or pockets of government power through the idea of the diplomat, etc. The clergy through the idea of the religious characters in the film, the police or military characters in this film, and we see their interactions. We see ultimately the application of satire and absurdity in their interactions. I mean, some of their exchanges between and among each other seem quite absurd. The details of dialogue are almost laugh out loud funny when you think about what it is they're actually saying. And some of the little quirks or intricacies of character come out in a way that also leads to a possibility of an interpretation of not just absurdity, but also decadence and also decay. And perhaps that decay is not just an institutionalized decay, but also a moral decay. Who knows? You be the judge of that as viewers of this film. The point that I think we should come away with when we think about this film is that this is also a film about class struggle, class conflict, and revolution. And it could be saying, too, that ultimately any mode of the application or the attempt to apply power could still be viewed through the satirical lens. And I think if that's the case, that would still ultimately be so wholly consistent with what could be perceived to be the Buñuelian view of the world and of politics and power and society and class. And if that's the case, then that, I think, is a very reasonable interpretation to have. Be that as it may, ultimately, what we have here in The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie is something that builds from a seemingly mundane event, that is, people trying to assemble, having a meal. How they're going to do that, what situations, what environments, what settings is that going to happen, who is going to be involved, what is their little story, why do they get thwarted in their plans, and through all that we get so much in terms of the micro and the macro, the very mundane detail that also links to the very broad and dynamic, which also links to various forms of societal and also political examination that is never exempt from the keen observing and satirically piercing eye of Luis Buñuel and company. And that ultimately leads to a film that is both, I think, thematically engaging, current, and fresh in terms of what it's trying to say thematically, and also, at the same time, a film that is innovative, that is funny, that is laugh out loud funny. And these situations are incredibly hysterical and absurd and silly, but that's the point. That is the point. So you're getting a dense, rich comedy of manners, a comedy of errors, also an absurdist, almost surrealist type of drama that also has its roots through the application of the dream logic into very current and very relevant social and political thematic discussions. So you're getting all this and so much more, I would suggest, when you're watching this film from 1972, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. So the Criterion Collection released at the beginning part of this year, 2021, this box set, as I mentioned, which is 3 films by Luis Buñuel, included in which, of course, is the film The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. Now, as I mentioned, I will talk in a separate video about the other films and also the set release as a whole, including the booklet and the essays. So let us save that discussion for another time, my friends. For now, let us focus in on what is found in this particular part of this release, this particular Blu-ray disc itself, which is given the spine number 102, by the way. And this is, of course, to remind us that the film did occur in the Criterion Collection DVD catalog back in the early days in this 2-disc set. again on DVD. Now we have what is described as being a new high-definition digital transfer of the film. And in case you are interested, you can find information in the booklet on page 54 about the particular transfer, and it mentions how it was created in high definition from a 35mm interpositive and 35mm magnetic tracks by Studio Canal. And so we know that there are other releases of this film through other labels, and we know this film did see a prior Criterion release, which I thought was really great, by the way. This is one of the great early examples of the DVDs that Criterion released in the early stages. As I say, this is spine number 102. But what we have here is a really lovely Blu-ray presentation of the film, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. And part of the presentation of this is, of course, the supplements as well that are included. And there are many supplements, and they are quite intriguing, and they further provide more detail and space for exploration and analysis of Buñuel's work and also The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. So let's start with the first one, which is called Speaking of Buñuel, or, and please forgive me for my poor pronunciation, A Propósito de Buñuel. This is from 2000. This is a great feature-length documentary, about an hour and 40 minutes or so. It had been found, in fact, on the second disc of this earlier Criterion release, as I referred to before, but it's great to see it back here again. And this is a 2000, a contemporary take on Buñuel's career and life, and also the films that he made, included in which, of course, is The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. I would actually suggest that this documentary serves to provide almost a primer or an introduction into the world of Buñuel himself, and also it does cover his filmography from the very beginning all the way up to the final stages, and it covers his life and some very important aspects in his life and some key people that he met along the way. And so this is, I think, a great way to get immersed in the world of Buñuel writ large, as well as being a discussion of various themes and concerns of Buñuel the artist that, of course, pop up with great potency and specificity in the film The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. It's a great documentary, and so if you are new to Buñuel, or if you are not new to Buñuel, whatever the case may be, this one is essential watch. So once again, it's called Speaking of Buñuel, A Propósito de Buñuel, from 2000. Next we have a work that is described as being a type of documentary-like homage to Buñuel that was first constructed in 1971, according to the Blu-ray. It's in fact described also here as being from 1970, but from the early 70s, shall we say. It's called The Castaway, in English, The Castaway on the Street of Providence, or The Castaway of Providence Street, and from the filmmakers Arturo Ripstein and Rafael Castanedo. And this is, in essence, a capturing of Buñuel and footage of him, which is caught in very intimate detail, and we see him in relaxed settings, but we also see him the man, which is also itself a reflection of Buñuel the artist. So it's described as I say, in the ways of being a type of homage to the man and the artist, which it is. And it also is very insightful because we see little details of his mannerisms, of his speak, and of what it is he's concerned with. For example, he's making drinks, he's making cocktails. And if we know anything about Buñuel, one of the things we see time and time again in loving fashion is the idea of drink, an alcoholic drink in his film, as well as meals and food and the getting together in this another type of societal construct, which itself can be said to be at the subject, at the heart of what we see in a film like The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. And so this, I would suggest, is another loving portrait that also has, potentially anyway, at its heart, a lot of the same nuance and complexity that we see in Buñuel's work as a whole. So it's so great to see it on those levels, plus many more. So this is the Castaway of Providence Street, or Castaway on the Street of Providence. Again, described as being from the early 1970s, and also described as being reworked or re-edited in the early 2000s, and we're getting that later re-edited version that we get for purposes of the Criterion supplements. Next, we have an episode of Once Upon a Time, Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, and this is a 2011 episode of this series, approximately 52 minutes, focusing now on the film, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. We have a lot of the participants of the film being interviewed. We have, for example, Jean-Claude Carrière and Stéphane Audran and BOURGEOISIE and Pierre Larry and others. And we get also some archival footage working with the film. So this is, and also discussions about some of the thematic concerns, some discussion about, say, the importance of meal and the societal construct that is built around the meal, and the illusory nature of this, especially when we consider how the meal is very much an establishment of certain societal class structures on the one hand, but it's also in many ways, in terms of a class struggle type of discussion, a quote-unquote palate cleanser in many senses of that term, because it's in many ways a way to equalize things as well as to maintain the sense of inequality. So it itself is very complex, and the way that Buñuel treats it is part of what is the beating heart of the film, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. So this and other things, I think, are being discussed with great convincing nature to them. So that and other reasons are what makes this particular episode well worth watching. Once again, this is Once Upon a Time, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. Next, we have what's described as being an episode, a 1972 episode, Pour le cinéma, and this is also making of The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. This can be described as being more of a making of at the time of the film itself, so again 1972. It is approximately 13 minutes. We do get a lot of the people, let's say, on set. We also get clips of the film. Please understand, of course, that when we get the clips, they are in this black and white filmed way, I think, to take into account the fact that it was from 1972, but it's that doesn't take away from the value and the content of the work, which is very revelatory. We're getting comments from actors such as Paul Francoeur and Fernando Rey, and others talking about their specific dealings with Buñuel and working with him, and especially someone like Fernando Rey, as we know, having a long relationship with Buñuel through the course of many films, including this. And so to get these comments directly from these participants, as well as seeing Buñuel at work and hearing his own thoughts, is invaluable, absolutely invaluable. And so this makes for another compelling place for analysis and discussion and consideration of this fascinating work, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. And then to round out, we have a trailer that is part of the supplements for Criterion, and it is a very witty and clever trailer indeed. So we get a number of supplements that were from, say, the earlier Criterion release, the Castaway on the Street of Providence, and also the feature-length documentary, speaking of Buñuel. But then we get a number of supplements that we didn't get from this earlier release, and we're getting here included in this Blu-ray. Some more supplements that are focused on The Discreet Charm of Bourgeoisie itself. And so they are very valuable and quite illuminating. And so I would suggest that this forms, again, another great basis for another examination into the world of Buñuel as rich and dense and complex a web and networking of cinematic chaos and freedom that we get from him in this film and others. This is a great place to start that journey and analysis. And also we have, as I say, the essays, but I will speak about those in a separate video. Ultimately, this is one of the key works of cinema. It's one of the key works from 1970s. It's one of the key works of Buñuel in the late period. It's also one of the key works of Buñuel, period. And therefore, it's one of the key works, period. And it is one of the key works because, among other things, it remains fresh and current due to its social and political thematic underpinnings. And it also remains at the same time a beautifully paradoxical poetic statement of Buñuel's cinema that is satirical and biting and cutting-edged. But even that satirical comic edge, we understand, ultimately can act like, as I say, a sharp razor blade in the hand of Buñuel that can cut through illusion, that can cut through social construct, that can cut through class, that can cut through anything. And that is the key and charm and wit and beauty of this film from Luis Buñuel, which is called The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.